In the late 1700s, Britain had a problem that no empire wants to admit. The British were obsessed with China, not politically, commercially. Chinese tea had become so embedded in British daily life that by 1800, the average working class family spent 5% of their entire income on it. Silk, porcelain, spices, everything coming out of China was in demand across Europe. London couldn't get enough, but China didn't want anything Britain was selling. The Qing emperor was blunt about it. China was the center of the world. It produced everything it needed: British wool, British clockwork, British manufactured goods. None of it interested Chinese consumers. The emperor famously wrote to King George III that there was nothing Britain produced that China required. This created a catastrophic trade imbalance. Every year, millions of pounds of silver flowed from Britain into China to pay for goods. Silver going out, tea and silk coming in. No balance, no reciprocity. Just a slow hemorrhage of British wealth into Chinese coffers. The East India Company, the corporation that effectively ran British trade across Asia, was watching its silver reserves drain and its shareholders grow furious. Something had to change. They needed a product, something China would buy, something so valuable, so desirable, that it would reverse the flow of silver entirely. They found it in the poppy fields of Bengal. Britain had controlled large parts of India since the mid-17th century, and India, particularly the Bengal region, grew opium in vast quantities. The East India Company had already been running small opium trades into China, enough to understand that demand existed. But what happened next was not an accident of commerce. It was a deliberate, calculated, corporate decision to addict an entire civilization. The company tightened its monopoly over Indian opium production. Bengali farmers were told what to plant, how much to grow, at what price they would sell, to the company only. There was no negotiation. Farmers who resisted faced ruin. The land that had grown food was converted to poppy. The infrastructure of an entire agricultural region was reorganized around a single product destined for a single market. By the 1820s, opium chests were being loaded onto company ships in Calcutta and transported to the Chinese coast in a supply chain of staggering efficiency. The company itself maintained plausible distance. It technically didn't sell opium in China directly. Instead, it auctioned the drug in Calcutta to private traders, who then smuggled it into China through a network of corrupt local officials and coastal dealers. It was corporate laundering before the term existed. Chinese officials knew what was happening. The Qing court issued ban after ban. Opium was illegal in China, had been since 1729. But the bans kept failing because the money flowing through the smuggling network was so enormous that enforcement became nearly impossible. Port officials were bought. Local merchants were partners. The entire coastal economy of southern China became intertwined with the trade, and the silver started flowing the other way. By 1830, the trade balance had reversed entirely. Chinese silver was now pouring out of China into British hands to pay for opium, just as British silver had once flowed to China for tea. The East India Company's finances stabilized. Shareholders received their dividends. The British government collected its taxes. Everyone in London was satisfied. Nobody asked about the 12 million Chinese citizens who were now addicted. The numbers from that period are difficult to fully grasp. In 1729, China imported around 200 chests of opium per year. By 1838, that number had reached 40,000 chests. Each chest contained enough opium to sustain dozens of addicts. Entire villages in southern China were described by contemporary observers as hollowed out, men unable to work, families destroyed, local economies collapsed inward as money that should have circulated through communities was spent entirely on the drug. This was not a side effect. This was the mechanism. An addicted population was a guaranteed market. Unlike tea or silk, opium created its own demand. You didn't need to advertise, you didn't need to improve the product. You just needed supply. And Britain controlled the supply absolutely, from the fields of Bengal to the ships on the Pearl River Delta. The Qing emperor finally decided enough was enough. In 1839, he appointed a man named Lin Zexu as Special Imperial Commissioner with a single mandate: end the opium trade permanently. Lin was brilliant, incorruptible, and completely serious. He wrote a letter directly to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience, asking how Britain could justify poisoning a nation for profit. He never received a reply. Instead, he got a war. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839 and moved immediately. He surrounded the foreign trading posts, the factories where British merchants operated along the Pearl River, and issued an ultimatum: surrender every chest of opium on every ship in the harbor, all of it. No compensation, no negotiation. The British merchants looked at their inventory. There were over 20,000 chests sitting in those ships. At market value, that was approximately 3 million pounds sterling, a fortune so large it was almost abstract. They surrendered it all. Lin had it destroyed publicly and methodically. Workers spent 23 days dissolving the opium in trenches, filled with salt water and lime, flushing it into the sea. Lin wrote in his diary that he felt he owed the ocean an apology for what he was putting into it. It was one of the most dramatic acts of drug enforcement in history, and it worked exactly as intended. It also gave Britain the justification it had been quietly waiting for. The destruction of British property, even illegally traded property, was presented in London not as justice, but as aggression. The Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston was furious, not morally, but strategically. He didn't care much about opium as a product. He cared about the principle that British merchants must be able to trade freely, everywhere, always. That no foreign government could seize British goods regardless of local law. It was the doctrine of free trade weaponized. And it was about to be enforced with cannons. The First Opium War began in 1839. Britain sent a naval expeditionary force that was, by any military measure, absurdly overpowered for what it faced. Chinese coastal defenses were built for a different era. British steam-powered gunboats, including the legendary Nemesis, an iron-hulled warship, that Chinese observers initially refused to believe was real, moved up Chinese rivers with near-complete impunity. Traditional Chinese war junks were destroyed before they could get within striking distance. City after city fell. Ningbo, Shanghai, Zhenjiang. The Qing military fought with genuine courage in many engagements and was systematically outgunned in all of them. The technology gap was not a small disadvantage. It was generational. China was fighting with weapons and tactics from a previous century against an empire in the middle of its industrial revolution. By 1842, it was over. The Treaty of Nanking was signed aboard a British warship, a deliberate choice of location, a reminder of who had won and how. The terms were extraordinary. China paid Britain 21 million silver dollars in reparations, including 6 million specifically to compensate for the opium that Lin Zexu had legally and righteously destroyed. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports were forced open to British trade. British citizens in China were granted extraterritoriality, meaning they could not be tried under Chinese law, regardless of what crimes they committed on Chinese soil. The message was simple and total. Britain could trade whatever it wanted, wherever it wanted, under whatever terms it chose. And if any government tried to stop it, this is what happened to them. The opium kept flowing, more than ever. A second Opium War followed in 1856, this time with France joining Britain, ending with European troops burning the Summer Palace in Beijing, one of the most spectacular acts of cultural destruction of the 19th century. More ports, more concessions, more reparations. The Qing dynasty, already weakened, began its long collapse toward the revolutions that would come in 1912. Back in London, the economics were clean and simple. India grew the opium. China bought it with silver. That silver funded British operations across Asia. The profits from the trade subsidized the entire East India Company apparatus, the army, the administration, the infrastructure of colonial control across the subcontinent. Opium wasn't a side business of the British Empire. For several critical decades, it was one of the primary financial engines keeping the whole system running. A conservative estimate suggests that by the 1850s, opium represented 15 to 20% of British India's total revenue. Without it, the finances of the colonial administration would have faced serious crisis. The roads, the railways, the army that kept India under control, all of it was partially funded by the systematic addiction of China. This is the part that rarely makes it into the textbook version of Victorian history. The opium trade didn't end cleanly, it faded. By the late 1800s, moral opposition in Britain had grown loud enough to be politically inconvenient. Missionaries returning from China brought stories that were difficult to ignore. Journalists published reports. A parliamentary commission investigated. In 1906, Britain finally agreed to phase out the trade over 10 years. And by 1917, the legal export of Indian opium to China was effectively finished. But by then, the damage was structural and permanent. The Qing dynasty had been fatally weakened, not just militarily, but institutionally. The reparations from 2 wars had drained the treasury. The unequal treaties had shredded Chinese sovereignty. The coastal economy had been reorganized around foreign trade on foreign terms. And tens of millions of Chinese citizens across multiple generations had lived through or died from addiction at a scale that no single country had ever experienced before. When historians talk about China's century of humiliation, the period from roughly 1839 to 1949, that Chinese leaders still reference today, the Opium Wars are the opening chapter. The psychological and political weight of that era shapes Chinese foreign policy in the present tense. The obsession with sovereignty, the deep suspicion of Western intentions, the absolute refusal to allow foreign interference in internal affairs. All of it traces a direct line back to the moment British gunboats sailed up the Pearl River to protect the right to sell drugs. But the more unsettling legacy of the opium story isn't what it did to China. It's what it revealed about how empires actually work. The textbook version of the British Empire emphasizes civilization, law, trade, and progress. The opium story strips that away and shows the mechanism underneath. When a market was needed, one was created, through addiction if necessary. When laws blocked commerce, those laws were removed by force and called obstacles to free trade. When an entire nation's government tried to protect its population from a predatory product, that government was defeated militarily and made to pay for the privilege of losing. This was not an exception to how empire operated. It was a particularly clear example of the rule. The financial logic that drove the opium trade, create dependency, control supply, and force access through power, reappeared throughout the 20th century in different industries and different geographies. Oil replaced opium as the product around which geopolitical violence organized itself. The specific commodity changed. The structure of the relationship did not. And the East India Company itself, the corporation that designed and executed the entire system, became a template, a private entity with its own army, its own courts, its own foreign policy, operating at a scale that made governments subordinate to its financial needs. Modern multinationals are modest by comparison, but the conceptual DNA is recognizable. Profit as the organizing principle, states as instruments, populations as markets. There is one final detail that tends to get lost. The Bengali farmers who grew the opium had no meaningful choice in the matter. The East India Company's monopoly meant they grew what they were told at prices they were given. The profits from their labor funded an empire they were subjects of, not participants in. When the trade finally ended, no one compensated them. No one apologized. The infrastructure that had been built to extract value from their land simply pivoted to other crops, other products, other forms of extraction. They are the invisible people in this story. As they usually are, the opium trade lasted roughly 100 years in its industrial form. It reshaped the balance of power between East and West for generations. It generated wealth that built institutions, funded wars, and endowed universities whose names still carry prestige today. And it was built on a simple insight that empires have always understood and rarely said out loud. The most profitable thing you can sell someone is something they cannot stop buying.